Carolina, 1839. The Fletcher plantation stands at the edge of a dying swamp, its windows clouded with humidity and silence. Locals say the house could breathe, the boards expanding, sighing, whispering at night like something alive. Inside, the walls remember things no human should. They remember Joshua Fletcher. He wasn't born a Fletcher. He was made one, branded and broken beneath that name. But when the master died in 1838, something changed in the air. His bloodline began to rot from within. 2 sons remained to inherit the estate, but they would soon learn the curse their father left behind. A servant girl once claimed she saw the master's portrait bleeding from its eyes, crimson dripping down to the floorboards where Joshua had once been chained. The next morning, that same girl vanished without a trace. By summer's end, both sons had started sleepwalking, their feet blackened with mud, their voices mumbling words no one could understand. The overseer wrote that he found them in the fields before dawn, kneeling in the soil as if waiting for orders from the ground itself. The town priest warned them, "The sins of the father do not die when the father does." He was right. Because beneath the Fletcher estate, where the swamp water kissed the roots of the house, something had awakened, and it carried Joshua's name. They say Joshua Fletcher was buried without ceremony. No cross, no coffin, no prayer. Just a hole carved in wet soil behind the sugar barn. But even that wasn't true. The night after his death, a thunderstorm swept through the lowlands. The graveyard flooded, and by morning the earth had shifted. When the slaves went out to check the site, the pit was empty. The body was gone. The overseer accused them of digging him up to start a revolt. He chained 3 men to the fence until their screams replaced the storm. But even then, the pit stayed empty. The following night, strange things began to happen. The oxen refused to pass the sugar barn. Tools went missing. Milk soured in the kitchen hours after being drawn. And the youngest Fletcher son, Samuel, started whispering Joshua's name in his sleep. He told his brother Henry that he kept seeing a figure standing by the trees, tall, silent, covered in mud. Henry laughed it off until he found footprints leading up to the back porch, bare, heavy, and soaked with swamp water. No one spoke of it again. But from that night on, the Fletcher house carried a smell that wouldn't fade, copper like blood mixed with rain. And when the wind turned east, it brought whispers from the sugar barn, low, rhythmic, human, the kind of sound a man makes when he digs. By autumn, the Fletcher brothers had grown pale and nervous, shadows dragging under their eyes. They didn't sleep. They didn't eat. They only stared at each other, as if each feared the other might change first. Henry, the elder, tried to restore order on the plantation. He forced the workers into longer hours, demanded obedience, burned every journal and ledger that mentioned Joshua's name. But the more he tried to erase the past, the more it bled through the cracks. Samuel grew worse. He muttered things at the dinner table, phrases in Gullah dialect, words he had never learned. Once during prayer he stopped mid-sentence and said, "He's watching through the floor." That night Henry found him in the cellar, barefoot, whispering into a patch of dirt. When he pulled his brother away, Samuel clawed and screamed, his fingernails torn, his teeth clicking together like something was forcing words out of him. The house servants began leaving one by one. They said the brothers had started talking in unison during the night, voices blending like a chant. And every morning the barn doors stood open, as though someone had been walking in and out. A traveling preacher passed through and warned Henry to abandon the property. Henry only replied, "A man can't abandon his blood." The preacher stared at him and said quietly, "Then your blood will abandon you." And so it began, at the Fletcher curse fully waking, not from the grave, but from the guilt still breathing inside that house. 2 weeks after the preacher's warning, the Fletcher brothers took in a visitor, Miss Eliza Rowan, a cousin from Charleston who came to mourn the family's decline. She arrived in a white linen dress that brushed the dust of the porch like fog. Henry believed her presence might bring calm, civility, maybe even hope, but Samuel refused to look at her. He said she smelled of wet soil. From her first night, strange things followed her. The clock stopped at the same hour she entered the house, 3:03 a.m., and the mirror in the main hall began to fog from within, as though someone were breathing behind it. Eliza often wandered at night. The servants whispered. She walked barefoot through the sugar barn and came back with her hem soaked in black water. When asked why, she said, There's someone buried wrong here. I can hear him humming beneath the boards. Henry grew uneasy but couldn't send her away. She reminded him of his mother. The same soft voice, the same pale hands. Yet when she smiled, it never reached her eyes. One morning Samuel burst into the parlor, trembling. He claimed he saw Eliza in the field, standing over an unmarked grave, her hands buried wrist-deep in mud. But when Henry ran out to see, the spot was empty. Only 2 footprints remained, larger than hers, leading back toward the house. And on the back steps, etched into the wood, were 2 words carved deep. Joshua lives. The Fletcher house had always creaked. Old timber, damp air, settling foundations. But now the sounds had rhythm. At first Henry thought it was the wind, maybe rats. But the pattern was unmistakable. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. Every night at the same hour, 3:03 a.m., the servants who hadn't fled refused to sleep indoors. They said they heard breathing under the floorboards, slow and deliberate, like lungs filling with mud. Samuel began whispering to it. He would sit cross-legged in the hallway, palm pressed to the wood, murmuring phrases in that same foreign cadence, words that made the air feel thick, heavy. Once Henry caught him humming. When he demanded to know what he was saying, Samuel only smiled and replied, "He's teaching me how to breathe where there's no air." Eliza watched in silence. She'd started placing candles around the cellar, white wax dripping down in rings. The light flickered strangely there, not yellow but faintly red, as if it burned through dust instead of air. Then one night, Henry followed the sound himself, down into the parlor, across the warped floor, to the spot directly beneath their father's portrait. The boards felt warm to the touch. When he knelt and pressed his ear close, he didn't hear knocking. He heard singing, like low guttural and human. It wasn't coming from beneath the house. It was coming from inside the walls. The portrait of Master Fletcher had always dominated the parlor, an oil painting too large for the wall. His painted eyes following every movement like a judge that never blinked. But in early November, something changed. The varnish began to bubble. Then, one morning, the servant boy who dusted the frame screamed and dropped his cloth, because a dark liquid was running from the eyes, staining the canvas. Henry insisted it was mold from the swamp air, but Samuel disagreed. He said quietly, "He's crying because he can see what's coming." That night the smell of iron filled the house. Henry tried to clean the portrait himself, but the cloth came away red. His hands shook. The stain refused to fade. Eliza stood behind him, whispering prayers that didn't sound like prayers at all, more like fragments of another tongue. When Henry asked what she was saying, she looked at the painting and replied, "He knows the sin that built this house. You cannot paint over blood." After that, the walls began to leak. Thin streaks of crimson appeared near the baseboards, following the pattern of unseen cracks. And when Henry called for help, no one came. By midnight, Samuel was gone again, his footprints leading to the sugar barn. The next morning, Eliza said calmly, "The house has chosen its heir." And from that day forward, the portrait's eyes never dried. The sugar barn had always been a place of work, sweat, and whispered threats. Now it had become something else, a shrine to fear. The night Samuel disappeared, the air around the barn thickened. Fog seeped from the floorboards like smoke from a fire that had never burned. Candles Eliza placed around the house flickered and bent toward the barn, as if drawn to it. Inside, Henry found footprints, heavy, uneven, and covered in swamp mud. They circled the old barrels, tracing patterns he could not follow. Samuel's voice, low and distant, echoed through the rafters. "He walks beneath us. He remembers." Henry called for Eliza. She did not hesitate. She whispered, "The barn is alive, Henry. It listens. It marks who belongs and who must vanish." At midnight, the wind shifted. The barn doors slammed. Henry ran to open them, but they wouldn't budge. Through the cracks, he saw a figure, tall, covered in mud, hair clotted with waterweed, moving in impossible silence. Samuel's shadow seemed to stretch toward it, reaching but never touching. A faint humming started beneath the floorboards, growing louder, like the heartbeat of something enormous trapped just below the barn's planks. Henry realized then that Joshua Fletcher had not been buried. He had become the house itself, its memory, its hunger, its judgment. When the doors finally swung open at dawn, Henry found only Samuel, kneeling in the mud, whispering the same words over and over. "He knows me. He knows us all." The barn had claimed its first secret and promised more. The swamp behind the Fletcher estate was alive with shadows that moved independently of the moon. Local farmers whispered of Joshua's spirit, wandering the reeds, dragging the sins of the living into the murky water. Henry and Samuel could no longer sleep inside the house. The whispering from the floors had followed them to the edge of the swamp, where the trees hung like spectres and the air smelled of decay. Eliza led them cautiously, carrying candles that flickered unnaturally, as if resisting the darkness. Every step into the swamp seemed to awaken something old, something older than the plantation itself. Mud clung to their boots, sticky and warm, like the swamp itself was breathing, pulsing, aware. Suddenly Samuel froze. He pointed at a cluster of trees. There. He waits where the water splits the roots. He sees the sins beneath the soil. Henry strained to see, but the swamp reflected only the moon, pale, broken, unyielding. Yet movement stirred among the reeds, silent yet deliberate. Eliza knelt and whispered over the water, tracing shapes in the mud. The swamp answered not with words, but with a low, vibrating hum, the same sound that had emerged from beneath the floorboards. By dawn, the trio returned, drenched and trembling. No footprints led back from the swamp except their own. And in the soft mud at the edge of the plantation, someone, or something, had left a single set of large, human-shaped prints leading directly toward the sugar barn. The swamp had not released its secret. It had only invited the next chapter. The house had grown stranger by nightfall. The walls seemed to pulse as though breathing, and the candlelight cast shadows that moved independently of their source. Henry wandered the hallway with Eliza, holding flickering candles. Every picture, every portrait seemed to watch him, their painted eyes reflecting more than light, reflecting guilt, fear, and something older than memory. Samuel walked ahead, barefoot, his whispers tracing the walls like fingers over stone. He waits in the corners, in the spaces between the walls. Henry's candle trembled in his hand. He noticed scratches in the floorboards, not from the past, but new, sharp, deliberate forming symbols that no living Fletcher could understand. Eliza stopped suddenly. The candlelight bent toward a closed door at the end of the hall, one Henry swore had never existed before. She knelt, brushing her fingers over the frame. This is where he chooses. The house decides who is marked. A cold wind rolled down the hallway, extinguishing the candles in unison. Shadows stretched thick and dark, and the hum from the floorboards returned, louder, insistent, human, yet impossibly deep. Henry's heartbeat thundered. In the sudden darkness, he felt something brush against his arm. Not flesh, but the weight of presence. Samuel gasped and whispered, "He is inside us. The house is him." And he remembers everything. When the candles finally reignited on their own, the door at the end of the hallway had vanished. Only the faintest smell of wet earth and iron lingered. Proof that the house had moved, shifted, or perhaps had simply chosen to watch them from elsewhere. November deepened, and with it came a fog that wasn't natural. It seeped over the plantation at dusk, thick and crimson-tinted, curling around trees and curling under doors. Henry watched from the parlor window as the fog moved like living smoke, swallowing the edges of the house. Samuel whispered in awe, "It carries him. It remembers Joshua." Eliza warned them to stay inside, but the fog crept through the cracks, dampening their clothes, chilling their skin, smelling faintly of iron and decay. When Henry dared to step outside, footprints appeared in the crimson mist, two sets, enormous, human-shaped but impossible to place. One led straight toward the sugar barn, the other back into the house. The candles flickered violently as the hum returned, deeper, resonant, and echoing as though the house itself was chanting. Henry swore he could hear whispers layered beneath it, apologies, accusations, prayers, and cries. By midnight, Samuel began repeating Joshua's name in a rhythm no human could have sustained. His eyes rolled back, his voice blending with the low hum of the floorboards. Eliza clutched Henry's arm. He is not gone. He is everywhere. The fog is his memory, the house, the swamp, it all is him. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the red fog receded. The night was silent again, but the scent of wet soil and rust lingered. Henry realized, with a shiver that ran to the very marrow of his bones, that the fog had chosen them. From that night forward, the Fletcher estate would never again belong solely to the living. The Fletcher house seemed endless at night. Hallways twisted unnaturally, doors appeared where none existed, and the floors groaned with a life of their own. One evening, Henry followed Samuel down a narrow corridor he had never seen before. The walls were lined with dark mottled wood, and the air was thick with a damp metallic scent. From somewhere deep within, a low murmur echoed, whispers layered and overlapping, too many to understand. Samuel walked with purpose, barefoot, tracing his fingers along the walls, as if reading invisible script. "He speaks through the house," Samuel said. "He remembers every wrong, every fear, every lie." Henry tried to ask questions, but the whispers intensified. They rose in volume until the words became indistinct, a chorus of accusations and warnings, human yet not human. Eliza appeared behind them, candles in hand. She traced symbols in the air with the flame, muttering prayers that seemed to push back the murmurs only slightly. "Do not linger, he is near. The walls are alive with him." Henry felt something brush against his shoulder, a cold, heavy presence that left him trembling. The floor beneath them vibrated subtly like a heartbeat, as if the house itself were aware of their every thought. At the corridor's end was a door, blackened and warped. Faint scratches scored its surface, as though something trapped inside had tried to escape. Samuel pressed his hand against it, and the whispers paused, then surged into a deafening crescendo. Henry understood then. The house was not a building. It was a witness. It remembered. And it judged. By December, the Fletcher house had grown intolerable. Servants who had not fled already were disappearing one by one. At first it was subtle, a missed meal, an empty bed, whispers that vanished when questioned. Then Samuel found one of the kitchen girls kneeling in the corner, her eyes wide and unblinking, lips moving in silence. By morning she was gone. No footprints, no drag marks, no trace. Henry's attempts to rationalize failed. The red fog returned nightly, crawling through hallways, curling beneath doors, settling on the floors like wet cloth. Wherever it lingered, servants would vanish within hours. Eliza said nothing, but her expression grew grim. She traced symbols along the walls and floorboards, muttering, "He does not choose randomly. He chooses those who feel the weight of the house, who hear too much." Samuel began wandering alone at night, muttering in the same strange cadence, following sounds only he could hear. Henry caught him staring into walls, fingertips tracing hidden patterns carved deep into the wood. The last servant remaining refused to speak of it. He only shook his head when asked where the others went and muttered, "Joshua. He is inside everything now. The house. It breathes through us." By the next dawn, Henry understood. The Fletcher estate no longer belonged to the living. It belonged to Joshua, to his memory, his revenge, and the wrath he had woven into every plank, every floorboard, every shadow. The plantation swamp had begun to speak. Henry first noticed it during the nights of heavy fog. The water gurgled and churned, emitting a low, resonant hum that seemed to echo beneath the house itself. Samuel became obsessed. He would wander barefoot into the swamp, returning with mud clinging to his skin, humming a tune that was neither human nor animal. Eliza warned him, whispering that the earth itself had been marked by Joshua's memory, and those who walked upon it were never the same. One night, Henry followed him, heart-hammering through the black reeds. They reached a small clearing where the mud swirled unnaturally, forming shapes, faces, hands, twisted and pleading, trapped in clay. The wind carried voices, layered and overlapping, like a choir chanting in a language older than Carolina itself. Samuel knelt, pressing his hands into the mud, and began to sing in harmony with the swamp, the low hum blending into his voice until Henry could no longer distinguish between the two. Eliza stayed behind, tracing sigils in the dirt along the edges, murmuring protective prayers. "He is the memory of all who suffered here. He is the house, the swamp, and the blood that soaked the soil." When Henry looked up, the clearing was empty, except for the imprint of Joshua's massive form, standing tall above the mud, staring down at them with eyes that burned like coals. The swamp had become more than water and earth. It had become a choir of judgment and memory, and anyone who entered its depths was never truly free again. In the parlor, Eliza placed a single white candle atop the mantel, a symbol of light against the darkness, but the flame refused to hold. Henry watched as she struck the match, and though the wick caught for a heartbeat, it sputtered violently, flickering like a dying heartbeat, then died. He struck again. Same result. "The house does not allow it," Eliza whispered. Samuel stood nearby, eyes glazed, murmuring Joshua's name. Each syllable made the air thrum, and shadows danced along the walls as though the room itself were alive, stretching in shapes too grotesque to comprehend. Henry moved to lift the candle, but the wax felt unnaturally cold, almost wet, like the blood that had seeped from the portrait months before. The scent of iron thickened around him, mingling with the stale dampness of the floorboards. Eliza pressed her hands to the mantel, tracing shapes in the air. "Protective symbols," she said, though the energy pushed back. "Joshua's memory has taken root. The house is feeding on our hope." For the first time, Henry realized, the estate didn't merely haunt them, it judged them. Every attempt to light the candle, to bring warmth or life, was resisted. It was as if the house itself, or Joshua through it, refused to allow any spark of defiance. And in that suffocating, silent room, Henry understood the truth. They were no longer residents of the Fletcher estate. They were its prisoners, and the house itself was Joshua. Late one night, Henry stumbled upon a door in the hallway he had never seen before. The wood was warped, blackened, and scratched with symbols that seemed to writhe when stared at too long. He tried the handle. Cold metal, unyielding. He pressed his ear to it. Behind it, he could hear the faint hum of voices, layered and discordant, chanting, crying, laughing. All at once, Samuel appeared silently, barefoot, tracing the scratches with trembling fingers. "This is where he waits. He marks the living and the lost here." Eliza followed, candles flickering in her hand. The flame bent toward the door as if pulled by an invisible hand. She whispered protective prayers, but they barely seemed to disturb the oppressive darkness beyond the wood. Henry pressed against the door again, and for a moment it gave way slightly, revealing a black void within. He glimpsed shapes, faces twisted in agony, hands reaching but nothing tangible. The void was alive, breathing. When he stepped back, the door was solid again. No hollow, no gap, as if it had never moved. Samuel shivered. "The house decides what you may see, and what you may never leave." Henry realized then that some doors were never meant to open. They existed to test you, to trap your mind in the memory of Joshua, in the echoes of the estate's sins. And outside, the red fog pressed closer, as if aware of his fear, licking at the walls of the house like a living thing. At exactly 3:03 a.m., Henry first heard it, a soft rhythmic thudding from the floors above. At first he thought it was Samuel sleepwalking again, but the steps were too heavy, too precise, moving in a pattern no human could maintain. The sound traveled the length of the hallway, echoing in perfect cadence. It seemed to call to something beneath the floorboards, a summons to the memory Joshua had buried. Samuel knelt beside the stairs, muttering in that foreign cadence again. "He comes for the living, for those who feel the weight." Eliza lit candles along the staircase, but the flames leaned away from the steps, as though the darkness itself had mass. Henry ascended cautiously, his heart pounding. The thudding grew louder, now a full march. Countless feet, neither animal nor human, moving in unison. On the landing, Henry glimpsed shadows forming shapes. Soldiers, slaves, children, all twisted and faceless, pacing in the air above the floorboards. Their rhythm was hypnotic, ancient and relentless. Samuel's whisper rose over the march. "He remembers. Every footstep we ever took, every command, every lash, every sin, all a part of him." The hallway vibrated subtly, as if the very walls were participating in the march. Henry realized with a chill that the house itself was conducting a procession of memory, and they were the audience, trapped, unwilling, but inseparable. By dawn, the march had ended. The floorboards lay silent, but Henry knew it would return, each night to remind them of Joshua's presence and of the sins that refused to sleep. The mirror in the master bedroom had always reflected more than appearances, but now its surface seemed thicker, almost oily, like liquid night trapped in glass. Eliza approached first, holding a candle. As the flame trembled, she saw shapes moving beneath the surface, shadows that mimicked gestures she hadn't made, faces twisted in silent screams. Henry stood behind her, uneasy. He touched the glass. The surface rippled like water, and suddenly he was no longer looking at his reflection. He was looking at the house itself. Within the mirror, he saw the plantation, the swamp, the sugar barn, the hallways, all drenched in red fog. Figures moved in impossible ways, servants who had vanished months ago, faceless forms tracing the floorboards, and at the center, Joshua, larger than life, staring directly at him with eyes that burned through memory. Samuel approached, whispering, "The mirror does not lie. It shows who we are, and who Joshua remembers us to be." Henry realized that anyone who gazed too long could see their own sins reflected in impossible forms, twisted by the memory of the house and the wrath of Joshua. Eliza warned, "Do not look too long. It will answer with the truth you cannot bear." That night, the mirror spat a low hum into the room, vibrating through the walls and floorboards. The house, the swamp, the red fog, all were extensions of Joshua's memory, demanding acknowledgement, demanding fear. By morning the mirror was calm, but Henry and Samuel both felt it watching still, an endless witness to the sins of the living and the dead alike. By midwinter, the Fletcher house had become a place of congregation for shadows. Henry, Samuel, and Eliza could no longer distinguish night from day. The house bent time, dragging them deeper into its memory. One night the red fog pressed against the windows, denser than ever. From beneath the floorboards, the familiar hum rose into a chorus of voices, layered and discordant. The house had gathered them all, servants, slaves, lost family, and the echo of Joshua himself. Henry watched in silent terror as Samuel approached the center of the parlor. He knelt, tracing a sigil in the dust, and whispered Joshua's name in a rhythm that synchronized with the house's pulse. Eliza lit candles around the room, their flames bending backward, straining against invisible wind. "This is it," she murmured. "The house decides who remains, and who becomes memory." The shadows began to coalesce, faceless forms moving toward Samuel, circling him, their collective presence pressing against Henry's chest. The walls vibrated as though the house itself were breathing, judging and remembering every sin ever committed within its timber. Henry felt his mind strain against the weight of history, memory, and wrath. He understood. They were not in the house anymore. The house was inside them, and Joshua's presence had claimed their fear as sustenance. And as the candles flickered, the red fog seeped through the floorboards, melding with the shadows, preparing to reclaim the living as it had claimed the dead. The final gathering had begun. By now, the house no longer needed voices, footsteps, or candles. It remembered everything on its own. Every scream, every betrayal, every unspoken thought. Henry wandered the hallways alone, the red fog curling along the floors, and felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing from every wall. The floorboards groaned with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. But deeper, older, a pulse older than the plantation, older than Joshua himself. Samuel knelt again in the parlor, tracing symbols that burned faintly into the wood. He whispered Joshua's name, and the walls answered with echoes of all who had suffered here, forming a chorus both terrifying and mesmerizing. Eliza watched silently, her candle flickering weakly. The house does not forgive, it does not forget. It remembers and it waits. Henry realized that everything, the red fog, the swamp, the sugar barn, the candleless nights, the vanishing servants, was Joshua's memory made flesh. He was everywhere yet nowhere, alive in the house, alive in the swamp, alive in the blood-stained air they breathed. The house had become more than wood and stone. It was a vessel of remembrance, of punishment, of eternal witness. Those who entered became part of it, woven into its memory like threads in a tapestry of wrath. And as Henry shivered in the suffocating silence, he understood the final truth. No one leaves the Fletcher estate unchanged, and no one leaves at all. Winter's longest night fell, heavier than ever. The red fog pressed tight against the house, and even the moon seemed swallowed. Henry, Samuel, and Eliza stood in the parlor, surrounded by shadows that moved with a consciousness older than memory itself. The candle Eliza carried wavered one last time, flickering against the oppressive darkness. Samuel whispered Joshua's name in a cadence that matched the house's pulse, and the walls vibrated, groaning with every remembered lash, every unspoken fear, every injustice embedded in the Fletcher estate. Then, silence. A deep exhale ran through the house, the sound of centuries, of all the dead and all the remembered, breathing as one. The shadows pressed closer. Henry felt the air thicken, his limbs grow heavy, as though gravity had shifted toward the walls themselves. The candle guttered, and Eliza's voice trembled. "It will not allow light." Not anymore. The flame died. Darkness consumed them. Not ordinary darkness, but a darkness filled with memory, judgment, and relentless presence. And in that dark, Henry realized the final truth. Joshua Fletcher was not a man. He had become the house, the swamp, the fog, the whispers, the floorboards, the endless memory of suffering and retribution. Outside, the red fog thickened. Inside, the house waited, and those who remained were no longer alive. They were woven into the estate's eternal recollection, its last light extinguished, and its judgment unending. The Fletcher estate would remember, always.